Hello Divi Nation and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to show you 5 unique ways to style Divi's contact form module. So these are the final results we're aiming to achieve. So without wasting a lot of time, let's dive in and let's get started. Okay, so let's start by creating a brand new page. So I'm going to come over here to Pages, click on Add New. We're going to name our page, and then I'm going to click on Use the Divi Builder. Next, I'm going to click on Use Visual Builder. Okay, so I'm going to build from scratch. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to close this for now. And then here on the top left, I need to go into my section settings to add a gradient background. So I'm going to click here on this gear icon to access my section settings. And then I'm going to come over here to background. And because we want a gradient, we need to come to the second tab. So I'm going to click on it and then click this plus button. And then I'm going to come over here to my first color and then paste my color in here. Right, so if you want to use the same colors as I'm using throughout this tutorial, I will leave a link to the post in the description below. Okay, so let's add our second color. So I'm going to click here on the second tab, paste my color in here. Next, we're going to go to the gradient type. So by default, it's set to linear, so we need this to be radial. And then for the radial direction, I'm just going to click this drop down because we need this to be set to bottom left. So I'm going to select bottom left. And then finally, we need to add our start and end position. So here we're going to set this to 34%. And then the end position needs also to be 34%. Next, we need to add some spacing on the top and the bottom of this to give our design some breathing space. So to do that, we're going to come over here to Design, Spacing, and we are going to add a padding of 200 both to the top and the bottom. So notice that I've activated this chain icon. This is so that when I add my value in here, it's automatically added to the bottom. So now that I've added this, we're going to go ahead and save because it's time now to add our column structure. So I'm going to come over here and click this plus button to add our row. And in that row, we're going to have 2 equal columns. So I'm going to select that. So before we add any modules, we need to add a background to our row. So I'm just going to close this for now and then click this gear icon here to access my row settings. Click on background. And then over here, what we need to do is to add a column 1 background. So I'm going to come over here to column 1, click this plus button to add my color. Now this time we are going to be adding a color with gradient. So I'm going to drag the slider down because we're going to add an RGBA value. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to paste my value between these brackets like that. So with that said, we're going to add our background image. So I'm going to come over here and click the third tab. We're going to click this plus button here to add our image. So I'm just going to use an image which is in my library here, but if you have your specific images that you want to use, you can use those from your computer. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go with this random one here and then click upload an image. Now it's important that you have to make sure that your image does not repeat. So over here on column 1 background image repeat, you want to click down on this drop down and make sure it's set to no repeat. Next, on background image blend, we're going to set this to screen. So I'm going to click this drop down and select screen. Now it's time to add our column 2 background color. So I'm just going to scroll down here. And for our column 2 background color, I'm just going to go in and add a solid color. I'm going to click this plus button and this color is going to be white. So I'm going to select that. Next, we're going to come over here to design, sizing. So we need to make sure that we equalize the column height. So I'm going to activate this. And then we're also going to set our padding, but this time we're going to remove the padding from the top and the bottom. So I'm going to come over here to spacing. And then for the padding here, I'm just going to activate my chain first and then add my 0. So the next stage now is to add some border radius, but we're going to do this to both the columns in the advanced tab. So I'm going to come over here to the advanced tab, custom CSS. So I'm going to come over here to column 1 main element and paste my CSS code in here, just like that. So as you can see, my rounded corners have been applied. So if you want to use this snippet, I will also link to the post in the description below. So that is where you can go and copy and use it. So we need to do this to column 2 main elements as well. So I'm going to scroll down here and add that. So now we have the rounded, the border radius on both elements. So that's looking great so far. So let's go ahead and save because it's time now to add our module. So I'm going to click here on this plus button, and in here we're going to add a text module. So I'm just searching for it and select it. So in here we're just going to add some text, and we're just going to call this hire me. And now we need to style this text. So I'm going to come over here to the design tab, click on text, and then let's start off with the font. So our font here is going to be called Satisfy. So I'm going to select it. So for our text color, I'm going to use this very dark gray. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool and paste my color in here. And then for the text size, I'm going to set this to 100 pixels. And for the line height, I'm going to set this to 1 EM. And for the text orientation, we're going to make sure that this is centered. Now, here's the thing. If your image is dark, it's a good idea that you make your text lighter, because that just brings a good contrast. So in this case, I'm just going to make this white so that it's easier to read behind this, in front of this image. But you can always play around with the different options and see what works. Now let's come over here to spacing and give this text some breathing space. So I'm going to come over here to spacing. So we're going to start off with our custom padding top. So I'm going to add 600 to the top. So now you can see that we see more of the image, which is fantastic. Next, we are also going to add a padding bottom of 100. So now we have more space on the bottom. So that is great. So like I said, over here, you can add a different color that works with the image that you have here in the background. So I guess even a dark gray could work here as well. Okay. So if you want to change that, you can just always go back over here, click this eyedropper tool, and then add your color. So again, that should work fine. So I'm just going to leave it that as a dark gray. Okay. Next, let's go and add our box shadow. So I'm going to scroll down here to box shadow. So I'm going to go with this option here. So let's start with the blur strength. So I'm going to set this to 80. And then the spread strength is going to be -16. And then on the shadow color, I'm just going to click this eyedropper tool. And in fact, that value is fine as it is. So you can just leave that default as it is. Okay, so now it's time to add an image to column 2. So I'm going to save this. Okay, so the next stage now is to add our image over here to this right column. So I'm going to click this plus button to add our new module. And then I'm going to search for my image module, select it. And then I'm going to click anywhere on this area here. And then I'm going to select my image, click upload an image. And now we have our image in place. Next, we're going to come over here to the design tab because we need to adjust the size of our module. So I'm going to come over here to sizing, and I'm going to set this to about 25 or even 30%. So I'm just going to drag this down and see what size I'm happy with. So I'm going to go down here to 30, but in some cases you may need to go down all the way to 25%. So now I'm going to center it, and I might as well set my settings for my mobile devices. So I'm going to click this little icon here, and then for the tablet, I'm going to set this to, let's say, 50. Let's see how that looks. So I'm just going to bring it down here to about 50. So I think that looks fine. And then I'm going to come over here to the phone. And for the phone, let's make it slightly bigger. Let's set this to about 60. Great. So now that we have all our different sizes all selected, I'm going to come back over here to the desktop, and you just have to make sure that module alignment is set to centered. Okay. Now let's add some negative margins to this image. So I'm going to come over here to spacing, and for margin top, I'm going to set this to -60%. So as you can see, -60 is way too much. So let's bring it down here until we're happy with where it is. So I'm going to start off with, let's say -20. Okay, so let's try -10. Okay, so let's do -15. So you just have to play around with this until you're happy with where it is located. So I think in my case here, -15% looks great. Next, we're going to save. And then we're also going to add a text module. So now we're going to add a text module. So I'm going to click this plus button here, search for my module, select it. So let's add our name here. So we're going to call this Mary Doe. Click on design, text. So now we need to customize this text. So we're going to start off with our text font. So we're going to set it to satisfy, just like how we did here. So I'm going to click here on this text font. So because we've used it before, it's going to be up here on the recent font. So I'm going to select it. For our text color, I'm going to make sure that this is set to that dark gray. So set that. And then for the text size, this is going to be set to 44 pixels. Right, so that's looking great. Now the final thing is we need to make sure that this is actually centered. So that is right below the image. So I'm going to center this. So I'm going to save this for now. We're going to add another module. So I'm going to click this plus button, search for my text module, select it, and then we're going to give this a title. So we're going to call this Web Designer. We're going to come over here to Design, Text, but this time we're going to set our text to Arial. So on the top here, I can search for it, select it. Next, let's add our text color. So I'm going to come over here to this eyedropper tool and paste my color in here. And as I mentioned before, if you want to use the exact same colors as I'm using throughout this design, I will leave a link to the post in the show notes below. Right, so next let's come over here and customize our text size. So we're going to set this to 18. And then letter spacing, we're going to set this to 2. And for our text orientation, we're going to make sure that this is centered. Next, let's add some spacing to this. So I'm going to scroll down, click on spacing, and all we have to do here is to add a bottom margin of 100 pixels and then save. Now it's time to add our contact form module. So I'm going to click this plus button and then search for it. I'm going to select it. So before we move ahead, we need to come over here to the name and email fields and make some changes to this. So I'm going to click here on this gear icon, click on design, layout, and we're going to make this full width. So now you can see over here to the right that this now has taken the full width. Okay, so let's go back and do the same to the email address. So I'm going to click here, click this gear icon, design, layout, and then make full width. So now we have the name and the email address all taking the full width. So let's go back over here and add an extra field. So I'm going to click this plus sign, and then on the field ID, I'm going to call this subject. And then I'm going to do the same for the new field. Okay, so we're going to go back over here. So now we can see that our subject has now been added. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to drag this so that is between the email and the message. Right, so now that we have all these, the next thing we need to do now is to come over here to elements and make sure that display capture is not on. So now we need to go to our form field text settings. So we need to customize this. So we're going to come over here to design, form field text. So let's start with the background color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool, and this color is going to be an RGBA value. So I'm just going to drag the slider down a little bit and then paste my value between the brackets. Next, we're going to come over here to the form field font, and we're going to set this to Arial. And for the font weight, we're going to set this to light and the size to 16. And then over here for the letter spacing, we're going to set this to 2. And then now we're going to go to the button settings. So I'm going to select here on the button. So for us to get more options to customize this button, we need to make sure that use custom styles for button is activated. So I'm going to select it. Okay, so let's start with our button text color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool and paste my color in here. So for our button border width, we're going to set this to 0. And for the letter spacing, we're going to set this to 2. So if you notice, I'm actually going ahead with the letter spacing that we've been using before for consistency purposes. So I'm going to set this to 2. And for the button font, we're going to make sure that this is Arial. I'm going to select it over here all the way to the top. And for the font style, we're going to underline this time. And we are also going to set our underline color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool and paste my color in here. So next, we're going to come over here to spacing. So I'm going to scroll down, select spacing, and we are going to start off with our bottom padding of 100. And then for our padding left and right, we're going to set this to 50. So I'm just going to add my value in here. And notice that I've also activated this chain so that my value is applied both to the left and the right. And the reason why we're doing this is we just want to give our form some breathing space. So the next stage now is to come over here to border, and we are going to set our border width of 2 pixels. We're going to add our border color by coming over here to this eyedropper tool. I'm going to paste my color in here. So this is where you get to choose where you want your borders. So you can come over here and add the bottom border if you wanted, but you can also just leave it as it is. So it depends how you want this to look. Okay, so the final part is to add our bottom margin. So I'm going to come back over here to spacing and add our bottom margin of 20. So as you can see here, this submit button here is way too close to the bottom. So let's add 20 over there. And now there's slightly more space on the bottom there. Okay, so that's looking great now. Let's go ahead and save. So this is our final layout of our first design. Let's move on now and create our second example. So I'm going to come all the way down here, click this plus button to add our new section. I'm going to click on irregular section. We're going to close this for now because we're going to start off by adding a background gradient as we did before. So I'm going to come over here to my section settings, click on background, and then select the second tab. So over here, we're going to start off by adding our first color. And again, these colors that I'm using are in the post, which I'll link to in the show notes below. Right, so I'm going to click this plus button here, add my first color. I'm just going to paste the value here, add my second color. And this time, this color is going to be white. So I'm just going to select it like that. And then for our gradient type, this time it's going to be linear. So that's already selected by default. Right, so the start and end position needs to be set at 50%. Next, we're going to come over here to our spacing. So let's click here on design, spacing. All we need to do now is to add some spacing both to the top and the bottom. So let's add our padding. So I'm going to activate this chain because my value is going to be the same. And that is going to be 200. So now we have more space here on the top and the bottom. So that's looking great. So the next stage now is to add a new row and a column structure. So I'm going to save this, click this plus button here to add our new row. And then I'm going to choose my column structure. And this is the one we're going to go with. So we're going to close this for now and go into our row settings and add our background color. So I'm going to click here on background, click this plus button and paste my color in here. Next, we're going to add a gradient on column 2. So I'm just going to come over here, click the second tab, click this plus button and add our first color. I'm going to paste it, add my second color. I'm going to paste it. So for our gradient type, it's going to be linear. And for the gradient direction, I'm going to set this at -160. Right, so the next stage is to set our gutter width. So I'm going to click here on design, sizing. On use gutter width, we're going to set it to yes, and we're going to set this to 1. So basically the gutter width is the space between the columns. So by reducing them, that means there won't be any spaces between them. Great, so we're also going to equalize the column height. So I'm going to set this to yes. Now let's go to spacing because we have a lot of work to do here. So let's start off with the top and bottom padding. So over here, we're going to set this to 0. So I'm going to activate this chain and add my value. So column 1 top padding, we're going to set this to 100 and the bottom needs to be set to 50. And then for the left and right, this is also going to be 50. Next, we're going to come over here to column 2 padding. So we're going to set this to 100, both to the top and the bottom. So I'm going to activate this chain and add my value like that. So hopefully you can see the changes that are happening over here to the right. Okay, so now I have top and bottom, and then we also need to add our left and right. So I'm going to activate the chain, and this time this needs to be 50 both sides. Right, so the next stage now is to come over here to the border because we want to add a border around this. So we're going to set this to 20. Make sure you enter 20 because if you put 209, it's going to look crazy. Okay, so that's looking much better now. Right, so now let's go to our box shadow. So I'm going to scroll down here, select my box shadow, and we are going to go with this option here. And for our box shadow blur strength, I'm going to set this to 45. And for the box shadow spread strength, I'm going to set this to -11. And the shadow color, this should be fine as the default. Right, so we're done with this. Let's go ahead and save. And then in column 1, we're going to add some text in there. So I'm going to search for my text module and select it. And then we're just going to add some text here, which just says shoot. Now let's go into the text settings. So I'm going to click this design tab, click on text. So let's start by setting our font weight to ultra bold. So I'm going to click here, select my ultra bold, uppercase. Let's give this a text color. So I'm going to come over here to this eyedropper tool, paste my value in here. Now for my text size over here, I'm going to set this to 100. And for the letter spacing, I'm going to set this to -10. Okay, so now the text is way closer together, which is what we need. So for the text size here, for the desktop, we set it at 100. We might as well go in and set our sizes for the other devices. So I'm going to click this little icon here. And for the tablet, we're going to set this to 80. And then for the smartphone, we're going to set it to 60. Okay, so that's looking better. I'm going to go back to my desktop view. And finally, for the line height, I'm going to set this to 1. Now let's go to the spacing. So I'm going to scroll down here, select my spacing, and all we're going to do here is to add a margin of 50 pixels to the bottom. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Great. So now we have a bit of spacing on the bottom, which is great. Now let's add our contact form to this first column. So I'm going to save this for now. In fact, our plus button here is hidden. So because we used our margins. So I'm going to click here on expand settings, click on wireframe view. Then I'm just going to add it this way. So I'm going to click this plus button and search for my contact form, select it. And then all I have to do now is to switch to the desktop view. And if I scroll down here, we can see that my form is in. Next, we're going to come over here to our elements because we need to make sure the display capture is disabled. So I'm going to click on no. Now let's customize this form. So I'm going to come over here to design, form text field. So let's start with the form field background color. Set this to white. We're going to come over here to our button, use custom styles for button, set this to yes. And then we're going to start off with our button text size. We're going to set this to 73. Next, we're going to add our button text color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool. Now this is going to be an RGBA value. So I'm going to click here on the slider and paste my value between the brackets. So here on the border width, we're going to set this to 0. Right, so the next thing we're going to do here is to set our button icon color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool and paste my color in here. And then over here where it says only show icon on hover, we're going to set this to no. Right, so let's choose the icon that we're going to go with here. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to go with this one here, right here. Right, so the next stage now is to add our box shadow. So I'm going to scroll down here and click on box shadow. I'm going to go with this option here. And then we're just going to customize the blur strength and the shadow strength. So our first setting here on the blur strength is going to be 36. And then over here on the spread strength, we're going to set this to -14. And our color here should be fine as it is. So I think this is done for now. So I'm going to go ahead and save. And then over here, we're going to add a text module. So I'm going to click this plus button and search for my text module and select it. So in here, we're just going to say contact information, click on design. Right, so let's start off with setting our font weight to ultra bold. So I'm going to click here on text. And then for the font weight, I'm going to say ultra bold. We're going to set the text color to white because right now, as you can see, this gray is not very easy to read on this dark background. So I'm going to set this to white. We're going to make this all caps as well. And we're going to change the text size from 14 to 23. So now it's nice and big. So, I mean, again, you can also adjust this, make it smaller if you want it all on the same line. So it's all up to you what you prefer. Okay, for the letter spacing, I'm going to set this to -1. Okay, so now the text is nice and close together. Great. So moving on, I'm going to add a blurb module to column 2. So I'm going to save this here and click this plus button. and search for my blurb module and select it. So I'm going to add my street over here. So the street is going to be called 123 San Francisco. Okay, so that's our street name. But of course, you can add whatever contact information that you need in there. And then over here for the image and icon, I'm just going to go ahead and activate use icon. And then we're going to use our specific icon here. So I'm just going to scroll down until I find a pin. So here it is. I'm going to select that. Now let's go to the icon settings. So I'm going to click here on design, image and icon. And for our icon color, we're going to set this to white so that it all matches with what we have here on our page. Next, we're going to set this to the left. So now let's customize this text. So I'm going to come over here and this is heading 4. So make sure that this is also set to white so that it's easier to read. So the text size here, we're going to set it at 15 pixels. And the letter spacing, we're going to set it to -0.5. Now, as you can see, this is way too close to where it says contact information. So let's add some margin. So we're going to come over here and click on spacing. So we're going to add a margin top of 120 pixels. And by the way, we don't have this text that we have right here. So let's go ahead and get rid of it. So I'm going to come over here, click on text, and we're going to get rid of this description right here. Okay. And then we're going to save. Now over here, we're going to use a similar style. So I'm going to duplicate this module like that. So let's do it one more time. So in here now, let's go in and make some adjustments. So we're going to click here on module settings. So for our image and icon here, we are going to change this to email. So let's just look for something that matches with email. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this one right here. And then for my title, I'm going to change this to my email address. Right. So this needs to be obviously your proper email address. Then we're going to save. And then finally here, this is going to be a phone number. So I'm going to go ahead and click here on my module settings. I'm going to title this and give my phone number in here. So I'm just adding a random number in here. But of course, you need to enter your proper number. Okay, so now that I have this all set, let's go in and change the spacing. So we're going to come over here to design, and then I'm going to click here on spacing. So instead of having 120 here to the top, I'm just going to reduce that to 30. So now it's closer. So I'm going to save that. And then we also need to do the same to this one right here. So I'm going to click here on module settings, design, spacing, and then change this to 30. Right, so this address information here is now much closer together. So there's also one thing I forgot to do there. So for the phone number, you need to go in and change the icon. So I'm going to come over here to image and icon and choose the one for the phone. So I'm going to go with this one and save. So pretty much this is our design. So let's go ahead and move on to our contact form number 3. Okay, so let's move on to style number 3. So I'm going to come over here and click this plus button to add our regular section. I'm going to close this for now. Next, we're going to add our background color. So I'm going to come over here and then just mouse over this area until I get my options to click this gear icon for my section settings. Click on background, and then I'm going to add my background color just like that. Next, we're going to add our spacing. So I'm going to come over here to design, spacing. So we're going to add padding of 200 both to the top and the bottom. So I'm going to activate my chain and add 200 to the top and the bottom, just like that. And then moving on, we are going to add our column structure now. So I'm going to save this, click this plus button to add our row, and I'm going to go with single column this time. So I'm going to select that. So we're not adding any modules yet. So I'm going to close this. Now it's time to add our text module. So I'm going to search for it and then select it. And then over here, I'm just going to make sure that I add my messages. So my message here is just going to say contact us, just like that. Now let's go into the text settings and set our colors. So I'm going to click here on the design tab, click on text. We're going to make this ultra bold. So I'm going to click here on the font weight, select ultra bold. And then I'm going to come over here to my text color and add my color. So this is going to be an RGBA value. So I'm just going to drag the slider down a little bit until I see these values. And then I'm going to paste between the brackets. Now it's time to add our text size. So over here, we're going to set it to 100. So it's nice and big. And let's go into the tablet and also set some sizes there. So I'm going to click here on this icon, click on tablet, and we're going to set this to about 86. And then for the phone, let's set it to 60 because as you can see here, it's overlapping. So we want to make sure that it is easy to read and it is not overlapping. So let's go ahead and add 60 here and see how that looks. That's much better. Okay, great. So I'm going to go back over here to my desktop. Now let's go and add our line height. So our line height here is going to be 1 EM. And then finally, we are going to center this. So I'm going to center it. In fact, there's one more step. Let's add some spacing. So we're going to come over here to spacing and add a bottom margin of -100. Okay, so that's looking great. Now it's time to add our second row. So I'm going to save this for now. And then I'm going to click this plus button here to add our row. So this time our row is going to have this column structure right here. So I'm going to select it. We're not going to add any modules yet. So let's close this and then go into our row settings. So I'm going to click here on this gear icon, click on background. So we're going to start off with our background color. So I'm going to click this plus button. In fact, we need to add it as a gradient. So let's come over here to the second tab, click the plus button and let's add our first color. I'm going to paste it, add my second color. Again, I'm going to paste it in here. Right. So now let's add our linear gradient. So in fact, it's already set to linear. So that's great. And then moving on, our gradient direction this time needs to be 160 instead of the default of 180. Right, so our start and end position, we're going to set this to 50 and 50 for the end. Now let's go to the sizing. So I'm going to click here on design, sizing. So what we're going to do here is we are going to set our gutter width to yes. And we're going to set our gutter width to 1. And as I mentioned before, the gutter width is just the distance between the columns. Right, so finally here, we're going to equalize the column heights. Now let's go to the spacing. So on the spacing, we're going to add a padding to the top and the bottom. So I'm going to click here on spacing. So on the top here, we're going to add 150. And then on the bottom, we're going to set this to 100. And then left and right, it's going to be set to 50. Now let's add our border. So we're going to come over here to border. So our border width, we're going to set this to 10 pixels. And then for our border color, we're going to click here on this eyedropper tool and paste the color in here. Now over here on the top, we're going to add some rounded corners as well. So we're going to set this to 20. Now let's go to the box shadows. In fact, here on this border, you can add the border all round. But if you want to set it to show only at the bottom, you can always disable the other options. So here, let's set it to the bottom. So right now it's set to 10. And then for the rest of them, you can just remove this border just like that. Okay, so now that applies it only onto the bottom one. So you can also go with this style if you choose so. Right, so let's go ahead now and add our box shadow. So I'm going to come over here to box shadow and we are going to go with this style right here. And then let's add our blur strength. So we're going to set this to 80. And for the shadow spread strength, we're going to set it to -24. And for the RGBA color, so this is fine because the default is okay. So we're going to leave it as it is. Right, so all is good here. We're going to go ahead and save. And then we need to add now our form. So we're going to come over here, click this plus button, search for my contact form. I'm going to select it. Right, so as we did before in the earlier example, we're going to make these cover the full width. So we're going to come over here to our settings, click on design, layout. So we're going to make this full width and then do the same to the email. We're going to click on design, layout. I'm going to make this full width as well. Then we're going to go back and then over here, we are going to click on elements and disable the capture. Now let's add some settings to our button. So we're going to click here on design, click on button, and then activate use custom styles for button. Now this gives us the opportunity to make our custom design to this button. Right, so what we're going to do is we are going to start with our button text color and set it to white. So I'm going to come over here to button text color, set it to white. Next, we're going to come over here to our button background color, but this time we're going to add a gradient. Click the plus button. I'm going to add my first color like that. Add my second color. So I'm going to click here on select color. I'm going to paste it. So our gradient type is set to linear. That is good. So for our gradient direction, we're going to set this to 155. And then for our start and end position, we're going to set this to 50 and 50. Right, so you can see here that this border width is not looking good at all. So we need to get rid of the border width. So by default, it's set to 2. So I'm just going to add a 0. Now for the button border radius, I'm going to set this to 10. Right, so let's click here on box shadow and set our box shadow. So I'm going to select it. And for our box shadow spread strength, we're going to set this to -2. And then for our shadow color, I'm just going to come in here, and now this time our color is going to be a hexadecimal value. So I'm going to drag the slider all the way up and then paste my value like that. Right, so the next stage now is to come over here to the border, and we are going to add a border for all these fields. So I'm going to set this to 5. So all the fields now, as you can see, they now have a rounded border of 5 pixels. So I think this looks great now. Let's go ahead and save. And then over here, we need to add a text module. I'm going to select it. And then here you can just add, your text that you need to add in here. Now I'm going to start off by adding a background color. So I'm going to click here on background, click this plus button. I'm going to drag the slider down a bit and paste my value between the brackets because our background color here is going to have some transparency on it. Now let's go to the text settings. So I'm going to click here on design, text. So for the font weight, I'm going to set this to light. We're going to make the text white, and the size needs to be about 15. And our text letter spacing to -0.5. Now let's head over here to spacing and adjust our sizes. So I'm going to click here on spacing, and we are going to start with the top padding of 12 pixels, both to the top and the bottom. So I'm going to activate my chain here and add my 12. And then left and right padding, we're going to do the same, activate the chain and add my value like that. Right, so the next stage now is to come over here to the border. So on the border here, we're going to add rounded corners to the top and the bottom. So I'm going to deactivate this chain. And then over here, I'm going to add 20 pixels. And then 20 over here to the bottom as well. So the rounded corner now is only on the left side. Great. Now let's add a left border style. So I'm going to come over here to this left border style, set this to 20. So let's see how that looks. In fact, let's increase it to 34. Okay, that looks much better. And then over here now on the left border color, we're going to set it to this bright yellow. Right, so now that we have all this set, as we can see, this is slightly closer to the edge here. So let's add a margin. So I'm going to come over here and add a left margin. So, okay, let's start off with 10. Maybe we might need to add a bit more. So I'm going to set it to 20. Okay, so I'm going to save now, and then we're going to duplicate this a few times like that, because we're going to be adding content into the other content areas. Okay, so you can always go in here and add your text. So I'm going to click here on this gear icon. So I'm just going to say email address. I'm going to save that. So I'm just adding random text, but of course you can go in and add the specific text that you need into this design. Okay, so now that I've got all that, now we need to add some margins to all this. So I'm going to come over here to design, spacing. So I'm going to add a top margin of 20. So now we have a bit of space between these, which is good. So I'm going to save this and then go into the second one and also do the same. Click on design, spacing, and then I'm going to add a top margin of 20. So now we have equal space between them. Next, I'm going to go ahead and save. What you could also do is you can leave these colors as they are, but if you want to go in, you can always go in and change these colors, and I'll show you quickly how to do that. So I'm going to come over here to design, border, and then this is where you want to change your color. So I'm going to click here on the border color and paste it here, just like that. And then you can do to the next one. Click here on this gear icon, design, border, and make sure you select the border style and then add your color in here. So pretty much that's our design. Let's move on to design number 4. So I'm going to come over here, click this plus button, regular section, and then I'm just going to close this for now because we're going to start off by adding a background color. So I'm going to come over here to my section settings, click on background and add my background color. Now we are going to move the spacing on this section. So I'm going to come over here to design, spacing, and I'm going to add a custom padding of 0 to the top and the bottom. So I'm going to click here on this chain, add 0. So this time we're actually removing all the space on the top. Okay, so now that we have this set, let's add a new row structure. So I'm going to save this, click this plus button here. Now, if you can't get to this, all you have to do is to come over here to wireframe mode and then click this plus button here to add your rows, your column structure. So I'm going to add single column. And then once you've added that, you can always go back here to the desktop view. So I'm just going to close this because we're going to start by adding a color to our background. So I'm going to click here on my row settings, click on background. So the color I'm going to add here is going to be a gradient. So I'm going to come over here to the second tab, click this plus button. So our first color here is going to be white. So I'm going to select that. And our second color is going to be an RGBA value. So I'm just going to drag this down a little bit. And then I'm going to paste my values between the brackets, just like that. Right. So the next thing we're going to do is to make sure that we choose our radial direction. So I'm going to come over here and change my gradient type to radial. And my direction obviously needs to be set to center. And then finally, we're going to add our start and end position. So I'm going to start off with 35% here and see how that looks. I can always go back in and adjust it with time. So here we can see we have a perfect circle, which is exactly what we need to achieve. Next, we need to come over here to design, sizing. So we need to start off by making this row full width. So I'm going to select here full width. We're going to come here to custom gutter width and set this to 1. Now it's time to go to spacing because we need to add our padding top and bottom. So we're going to come over here, select our spacing, and then for our padding, I'm going to set it to 160 and then activate this chain so that my value is added both to the top and the bottom. Right, so the next stage now is to add our text module. So I'm going to save this, click this plus button, search for my text module. I'm going to select it. So we have some text in here, so I'm just going to reduce the amount of text that we have. Now let's go to the text settings. So I'm going to click here on design, text. I'm going to search for my font. Okay, so our font here is a Brill fat face. I'm going to select it. What a funny name. Right, so our text color, we're going to click here on this eyedropper tool. I'm going to paste my value in here, just like that. Right, so for my text size, I'm going to set it to 45. And then for the tablets and phone, we're going to set it to 34 and 20. Right, so next for the line height, I'm going to set it to 1. And then for my text orientation, I'm going to make sure that this is centered. Now let's head over here to our spacing and set our values. So I'm going to click here on spacing. So I'm going to start with margin top. So I'm going to set this to 300. And then for the top padding, I'm going to set it to 50 and 50 for the bottom padding. So I'm going to activate this chain and set my value here. Right, so the next stage now is to add our contact form module. So I'm going to click here on save, click this plus button, and my contact form is here. We also need to make these fields full width. So I'm going to come over here to this gear icon, click on design, layout, and then I'm going to set this to full width. Come back over here, do the same to my email. Click on design, layout, make full width, and then I'm going to go back. Now for the display capture, we're going to click here on elements and make sure that display capture is set to no. So let's go to our form field background color. So I'm going to click here on design, form field text, and then form field background color. I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool and paste my first color here. Next, we're going to add our text color. So I'm going to come over here, click this eyedropper tool and paste my color in here. Right, so the next step now is to go to our button settings. So I'm going to come over here to button, activate use custom styles for button. So I'm going to start with the button text size. So by default, it's set to 20. I'm going to set this to 88. So it's going to be massive. Next, I'm going to set the button text color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool. Click here on drop down and paste my value here between the brackets. Right, so the next stage here is to add our button background hover. So I'm going to click this little icon here. Click on hover, and then I'm going to add my hover color. So I'm just going to drag this down a little bit and then paste my value between the brackets, just like that. Next, for our border width, we're going to set this to 0. Right, so now we need to add our icon. So the icon we're going to go with is a heart. So I just need to locate that. And here it is. Right, so over here, I'm going to add my icon color. So I'm going to paste it. Now let's go to sizing because we need to do a lot of customizations here. So I'm going to select sizing, and then I am going to reduce my width to 42%. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to center this. So sometimes your screen here may be way too big. So you may need to go in here and make further adjustments. So like in my case here, I just need to make this even much smaller. Now let's go to spacing and make sure everything is centered correctly. So I'm going to start off here with my bottom margin of 200, left and right padding of 50. I'm going to activate the chain. Next, I'm going to come over here to my border and set this border to 10. And the final stage here is to align our button to the right position. So I'm going to click here on advanced, custom CSS, and we are going to add our custom CSS here to the contact button. So I'm going to come over here and paste it. Okay, so now you can see it's now moved into position. Great. So now with all that set, let's go ahead and save. Now we are working on the final design. So we're going to click here on this plus button and add our regular section. So we're going to close this for now. And we're also going to start with adding our background gradient. So I'm just going to come over here and click here on this gear icon. And then I'm going to click here on background, click the second tab, click this plus button to add our gradient, and then start with my first color. So I'm going to paste my first color in here. And my second color here is going to be white. So I'm going to select that. And then for our gradient type, instead of having it linear, we're going to set this to radial. And then the direction here is going to be left. And for our start and end position, we're going to set this to 36. Next, we're going to go to our spacing. So we're going to click here on design, spacing, and we're going to add a padding of 250, both to the top and the bottom. So with that said, now it's time to add our column structure. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to click this plus button here, and we're going to add 2 equal columns. So I'm going to select that. So for now, let's close this. We're not ready to add our modules yet. So I'm going to click here on this row settings, click on background, and then we're going to set this background color to white. Next, we're going to come over here to our column 1 background color and add our color. So again, I'm going to paste it in here. Now let's click on design and change our sizing. So I'm going to come over here and we're going to use the custom width. So we're going to set this to yes first, and then we're going to change our unit to pixels because we have options here of either choosing percentage or pixels. So make sure it's set on pixels. And then we're going to set our custom size of 1730. So we're going to use custom gutter width. And again, we're going to set this to 1. And then we're going to equalize column height. Now let's go to our spacing. So over here, we're going to start with our top and bottom padding. So we're going to set this to 0. So for our column 1 top padding, we're going to set this to 200. And for the bottom padding, we're going to set this to 150. And then for the left and right, we're going to set this to 50. So I'm going to activate my chain. So my value now is added to both sides. And then for the column 2, I'm going to set this to 200. for the top and 150 for the bottom. So all I'm doing here is just to create some space around the elements that we're going to be adding in to these columns. Right, so the next stage now is to go to our box shadow, and then we're going to go with this style here. So first of all, we're going to add our box shadow blur strength and set it to 56, and the spread strength -17, and then save. Right, so let's start off now by adding a text module here to column 1. So I'm going to search for my text module. I'm going to select it. So of course you can add whatever text that you need. So I'm just going to get rid of most of this and just leave that single line. Now let's go to the design tab and make some customizations to this text. So I'm going to click here on design text. So first of all, we're going to choose a font. So I'm going to click here on default and search for my font, Cambay. So I'm going to select it. And then our text color here is going to be black. So I'm going to select black. Our size is going to be 26. Our letter spacing is going to be -0.5. And our text orientation this time is going to be set to the right, like that. Now let's go to the margins and add some margin to the top. So I'm going to click here on spacing. I'm going to add a margin top of 60 pixels and then save. So we're going to clone this twice. And then you can just go in and customize the text that you want to add in here. So I'm just going to use text here from Lorem 2. I'm going to save that and then come back into this one here. Do the same. And then you can also modify the top margins. So I'm going to come over here to design, spacing. So here we have 60. So you change this to 80. So we have a bit more. I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to do the same here as well. Change the margin to 80, like that, and then save. Right, so over here now, let's add our contact form. So I'm going to click this plus button and select my contact form module. Right, so I'm going to come over here into the name, design, layout, and we're going to make this full width. I'm going to go back again, go into the email, design, layout, make this full width as well. Then I'm going to go back. And then the display capture, we need to make sure that it's off. So I'm going to click here on elements and this option here on display capture, set this to off. Now let's work on the form field. So I'm going to come over here on design, form field text. So the form field background color, I'm just going to click here and this is going to be an RGBA value. So I'm just going to drag this down a little bit and then paste my value between the brackets, just like that. Now I'm going to make sure my font here in the form field matches the font that I used here. So I'm going to click here on form field font and our font Cambay should be over here on the top like that. That's great. And then moving on, let's move on and add our button and customize our button. So I'm going to click here on button, use custom styles for button. And then the first thing I'm going to do is to set my text size to 64 for the button text color. Set this to black. Right, so let's go over here to our button background color. So I'm going to click here on the second tab, click the plus button, and then I'm going to add my first color. Paste it in here, add my second color. But this time, this is going to be an RGBA value. So I'm going to paste this between the brackets, just like that. And then for the gradient type, I'm going to make sure I select radial and then center it. Okay, so I'm going to click here, radial, and then it's centered here, which is great. And then for our start and end position, I'm going to set this to 25 and 25. Right, so next for the border width, I'm going to set this to 0. Right, so only show icon on hover for button. We're going to set this to no. And then over here, we're going to choose our icon. So let's go with this one here. Now for the button, what you could also do, instead of just saying submit, you can always change the text here to something else. Now let's add some margins. So I'm going to scroll down here to spacing and we're going to add a margin top of 50 pixels. Now it's time to add our border. So I'm going to come over here to our border option. And this time the border that we're going to add is going to go to the bottom. So I'm going to select my bottom border here and I'm going to set this to 0.5 pixels. And then for the button border color, I'm going to set this to black. So pretty much these are our designs. As you can see, they're all custom, they're all different, and this is how you can go in and customize your styles. So let's save this and let's take a look at all of them now that we've designed all of them. Okay, so I've saved the page. I'm going to exit the Visual Builder. Right, so we're going to start here with the top. Here's our second design. So there you have it. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and do follow us on our social media platforms. By doing so, you'll be notified every time we release new tutorials. Until next time, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.